Purim and Pesach. Wait a minute.
Yes, thank you.
Push the little button saying I got it about the recording.
Got it.
I'd like to talk something about Pesach and something about the festival cycle in general.
You had mentioned Ramadan as
Yeah,
part of
that's right. So about 5 or 6 months ago, I was just looking forward to see what the actual dates of Pesach in the Western calendar would be, and realized that Pesach, Christian Holy Week, which often but not always is connected with Pesach, and Ramadan were all happening in the Western month. Actually, the word month comes from moon. It's really moons, because the Western month was also originally a lunar moon. So they were all happening in what we call April. And so was the yahrzeit of Dr. Martin Luther King, and the anniversary exactly a year before his death of the most profound and important speech he gave, which was at Riverside Church in New York City, called Beyond Vietnam. And it truly was beyond Vietnam. He looked at Vietnam a lot in the speech, made his, wasn't his first, but a major public statement against the war, and then talked about what was going on in American society and beyond Vietnam, what we had to face. So for one thing, he said that there were 3 deadly triplets afflicting America, and he was speaking to an assemblage of the clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam. And he said, if we didn't address those 3 deadly triplets, a generation or 2 from then, we would be gathering as clergy and laity concerned about, and he listed 6 countries that we would be in some kind of illegitimate and immoral war with. And the 3, to which I would add a quadruplet, the 3 were militarism, racism, and materialism. I would add sexism, which wasn't on his agenda list at the time in 1967. So in those days, I was a kind of secular, casually Jewish activist around civil rights and opposing the Vietnam War. And that's who I was on the morning of April the 4th, 1968, 1 year exactly later. And of course, he was murdered that evening. And for a week, there was turmoil in Washington. There was a Black uprising. The President, Lyndon Johnson, sent the army to occupy the city and imposed the curfew. I can't remember whether I described the scene in one of my 2 previous visits with y'all, but the army was everywhere. The curfew, in theory, was everywhere, but the police didn't care if white people were on the streets. So a whole bunch of us who were white civil rights or anti-war activists created a network to get food and medical supplies and lawyers and doctors to the Black community. And that's what I was doing for a week, night and day. And then came the first night of Pesach, of Passover. As a grown-up, that night, the night of the Seder, was the only piece of Jewish life that I really cared about, of religious Jewish life. I had had what became a totally boring bar mitzvah and was no longer interested beyond that, because I was not interested in being bored. There were many exciting things going on in the world. But Passover was not boring. Passover was about freedom and justice. My parents were activists, and so I liked it. So a week after Dr. King was killed, I walked home to get ready for the Seder. And that meant walking past the army. And it meant walking past a Jeep with a machine gun pointed at the block I lived on. And my kishkas began to say, this is Pharaoh's army. You're going home to celebrate the rebellion against Pharaoh, and this is Pharaoh's army. So that was like the Seder, which had been serious, became a volcano. And during the Seder, the traditional Seder, there's a passage that says, in every generation, we are obligated to look upon ourselves as if we go forth from slavery to freedom, not only our great grandparents. And that had never been a terribly important sentence to me, but that night it was crucial. And I found myself, I was a delegate to the Democratic Convention, the ill-starred, infamous Democratic Convention in 1968 in Chicago. I came out of it. Every aspect of who I thought I was erased by the convention. Independent scholar, political activist, all erased by Mayor Daley and the police and the National Guard, except for one thing, and that was the memory of how moved I'd been by the Seder. And that fall, I found myself, and I mean, I found myself, it wasn't like I decided. I found myself writing what became the Freedom Seder. I had no idea that people would get all excited about writing their own Sedarim, and about all kinds of questions. I mean, gay and lesbian liberation Seders, Seders against US intervention in Central America, vegetarian Seders. There was one called the Seder of the Liberated Lamb. Seder is about nuclear weapons and the nuclear arms race. Seder is even more aimed at racism than the one I wrote, which is a major element of the one I wrote. It was like, you know, if you have a supersaturated solution and you drop a crystal into it, the whole solution turns into a crystal. And it was like, without even knowing it, a big hunk of the Jewish community was a supersaturated solution, just waiting for somebody to do something that would make Jewish practice real in our own lives. And I dropped the crystal and whoosh. So it wasn't just me. It was a lot of people. And it had a deep effect on me. I mean, I never would have imagined why would I become a rabbi? But I was so deeply moved by what I was learning that it took me a long time. I acted like a rabbi before I was one. I finally decided to become one. So now what does it mean to me to be a few weeks before the Pesach of 2022, 53 years later? It means a lot, almost everything. Here we are facing crisis upon crisis upon crisis. Each one of them at least as big as the murder of Dr. King and the explosion in Black communities all across the United States in 1968. A 2-year plus plague. Plagues, besides that one, here and there brought on by the climate crisis. Wildfires consuming huge chunks of California and huge chunks of other countries, Australia, for example. Floods, places that thought maybe once in 500 years they'd have a flood big enough to do X, and they'd have 2 or 3 of them in a decade. Famines and floods of refugees. And in neighborhoods where coal companies had their power stations and where oil refineries had been built, we were having epidemics of asthma and cancer in those neighborhoods because of free floating in the air coal dust and oil fumes. And suddenly, in the Europe that we thought we had figured out a way to keep not at war, one of the great powers with a nuclear arsenal, second only to the American nuclear arsenal, is fighting a war. Plagues. Plagues brought on by arrogant and cruel pharaohs. Some people read the Torah story of the plagues as meaning that God was a kind of super pharaoh in the sky. And when God got mad at the pharaoh, God threw these plagues at the pharaoh and his whole country. I read it slightly differently. I read it that what Moses and Aaron and their sister Miriam learned, and the meaning of the new names of God that they learned, was that all life was interconnected. And if Pharaoh was going to be cruel to human beings, the earth itself would be cruel or erupt in what we call the plagues, because the interconnection was so powerful. Pharaoh didn't get it. Pharaoh thought, oh, like a former Secretary of Defense of the United States not so long ago, oh, stuff happens. He would get scared when there was a plague. And then he would beg Moshe to take the plague away. and Moshe would pray and the plague would vanish. And Pharaoh would say, wow, that scared me, but it was just an accident. Moses and Aaron and Miriam knew it was not just an accident. It was all connected. When they went to Pharaoh and said, this is all connected, let our people go, have some good sense. And by the 7th or 8th plague, his own counselors, his own advisors were saying, don't you know you're ruining Egypt? You're ruining the whole country. Let them go already. He said, says who? You say you want to go off for some uncertain amount of time and worship your God. Well, who is this God of yours anyway? And I think Moses just breathed. He breathed Yud-Hey, Wav-Hey, or Y-H-W-H. And he breathed like, and Pharaoh said, what are you doing breathing at me? That's your God breathing? That's crazy. What's wrong with you? The Nile is a God. I am a God. Breathing, that's not a God. I think that name meant all life breathes. All life is interconnected by breathing. Vegetation and animals breathe each other into life. They may not have known that in detail, but they knew that something about breathing was at the heart of life on the planet. So the breath of life ended up blowing a great wind, so the story goes, at the Red Sea or the Reed Sea. And Pharaoh was blown away, literally. And we end up with this remarkable story. Some people say, oh, never happened, it's all just a novel. Well, maybe, but if it's a novel, it's one of the greatest novels in human history because it's had such a profound effect on human society. And we're at a place again where the people I call corporate carbon pharaohs, corporate carbon pharaohs, are bringing plagues on the planet again. And it's the whole planet this time. It's not just a country that's a narrow country, that's its name in Hebrew. Mitzrayim means the narrow place. Around the Nile River, it's the whole planet. So what do we do? All right, so we have been working, we means the Shalom Center, and we brought together a coalition that's multi-religious. It's got several major Jewish organizations and people. It's got a group called Dayenu and one called Chazon, which are both in different ways working on environmental questions. It's got the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism and rabbis from the Reform movement. It's got several other important Jewish environmental groups. It's got a group called Green Faith, which is a global interreligious organization, which has major connections with Buddhists and Hindus outside as well as inside the United States, outside where they're much bigger, as well as with Christians and Jews and Muslims inside the United States. And what are we doing? Well, Green Faith, responding to this array of major and a few minor religious communities, has called this time from mid-March until early May, beginning with a holiday kind of, I haven't looked back at the etymology, but its name is Holi in English letters. It's Holi. It's a Hindu festival. It comes in March. All these festivals have something to do with the spring, with the renewal of life in the Northern Hemisphere in the spring. And we're drawing on that renewal of life, because what we're facing is a disaster, if not the death of much of the life on the planet. And for Jewish groups and some Christian groups and some Muslim groups, what we decided to do, because there is a deadlock in the US government about dealing with the climate crisis and many other things too. It's the first time I've ever paid attention to the first half of the word deadlock. It's a really deadly deadlock. Because of that, we decided to try to focus on some other way of making a difference. And what we have focused on is the banks and bank-like pools of money that invest billions, literally billions, in burning the earth. That's their business plan. Invest money and get returns on the money from businesses that are burning the earth. That's what they do for a living or a dying. So, for instance, Chase Bank, I'm sure there's one near you because there's a Chase Bank almost everywhere in the United States. We're planning on mostly Tuesday or Wednesday of Passover week to have people demonstrate in front of those banks. If people want to, they might decide to commit nonviolent civil disobedience and do it inside the bank. But for most people, I think probably outside the bank, demanding that they stop investing in burning the planet, that they stop investing in outfits like Exxon, BP, etc. And it turns out it makes a difference now. The big oil, big coal, big unnatural gas companies used to make enormous profits with no help. But turns out that now the difficulty of digging up that stuff, of extracting it, is greater. It costs more. And they make it only by getting loans from these companies, from these banks. And BlackRock, a kind of bank-like institution, and a few others like it. So that's what we've been organizing. And now I want to say something more about not just Pesach. I wrote a book called Seasons of Our Joy. It's the most broadly read book that I've written. And what it said was, and it was totally astonishing, 40 years ago when I wrote it, what it said was that all the Jewish holidays were ultimately grounded in earth and in the dance of the earth, the sun, and the moon. In those days, Nobody paid attention to that. They didn't pay attention to the fact that Passover always comes in the spring, and that the rabbis constructed the calendar so it has to. That's why we have a combination of lunar solar calendar, not like Islam, which has a purely lunar calendar. So the Ramadan is in April this year, but it might be in March next year or whenever. They decided it had to be anchored, that Passover had to be always in the spring. And the origins of Passover before it became the festival of liberation were a farmer festival and a shepherd festival. A shepherd festival for the birth of lambs in the spring, and a farmer festival for the growing of barley in the spring in the land of Israel. So then some event was so hot and intense that out of those two festivals, barley, when people ate the new bread with no leavening to honor the coming of the barley harvest, and people ate a roasted lamb to honor the birthing of the lambs. Those two items got fused into this intense festival of liberation. And in fact, the origin of the word Pesach is that it's a skipping dance, sort of, that the lambs danced when they were newborn. They didn't exactly yet know how to walk right. So they stumbled and they half toppled. And then the shepherds created a dance to imitate them. That was the way you celebrated the birth of all these lambs, skipping. And then the tradition applied Pesach, skipping, to God or the angel of death, skipping over the houses of the Israelites. And so it became the dance of skipping over and the festival of skipping over. And that's where we get the word Pesach from. And so, of course, it had to be in the spring. And the other festivals, when I was a kid, nobody taught me that Hanukkah, at the darkest time of the year in the Northern Hemisphere, the dark of the moon, the 25th of a lunar month, is always the dark of the moon. It gets darker and darker and disappears. And then 8 days later, slowly comes back with a crescent moon. And it's close to the winter, what do you call it?
Solstice.
Solstice, thank you. Nobody taught me that lighting 1 candle, 2 candles, 3 candles, finally 8 candles, lights, might have anything to do with it being the darkest time of year. Nobody taught me that. It was all about the Maccabees or about the legend of the 1 bottle of oil that lasted for 8 days, keeping the temple menorah lit. But the fact that it was grounded in earth and in the sun, no. But I realized that when I began digging into Hanukkah. And so the chapter on Hanukkah in Season of Our Joy says, this is a festival about light and dark. Even the historical part is about, in a dark time, when a big army was occupying the land of Israel, unexpected light from these crazy guerrilla It's the Maccabees. Hope in a time of despair is the equivalent of light in a time of darkness. That's where it starts. Sukkot, we know, is about the harvest. And of course, that's a season. Shavuot, which we now celebrate as the coming of the Torah, was the coming of the wheat harvest. And the reason we count from the second night of Passover till the 50th day, Shavuot, is that we're counting from the barley harvest at Passover time to the wheat harvest at Shavuot time. The Torah never says when the Torah came. But the rabbis needed, I think, they needed a festival as important for learning Torah as Passover was for freeing the people. So they played around with the dates in the Torah about Shavuot, and they said, no, close enough. And 7 times 7 plus 1 is a good mystical number. So that's why we have the Shavuot we have, because the rabbis, what they did, they weren't farmers, right? The rabbis weren't farmers, and they weren't shepherds. They were word people. They really loved words. They were good at it. I love words too. I love puns in Hebrew and in English, and especially puns that are in Hebrew, English fit together. Like when we say the blessing for learning Torah, we say la'asok b'divrei Torah. And my friend and teacher, Rabbi Max Tickton, alav shalom, taught me that la'asok could be understood meaning soak yourself in the living waters of the Torah. So that's what rabbis do. They love words. I hope they love justice, that they love love with their congregants and so on. But they, for sure, what makes them rabbis is they love words. So you can go through the whole cycle. And I've begun to think it's like something, a combination of a proverb and a slogan. I've been thinking all the holidays, all the Jewish holidays anyway, and most of the others are ultimately the children of a sacred marriage between the earth and a given community, the Jewish people, the Christian church, Islam. All the festivals are that the children of that sacred marriage. And now the earth and the human race too, each of those peoples is in trouble. And when your parents get in trouble, we all know that one of the important things that happens, it doesn't always happen, but it often does, mostly does, that the kids come to the support and healing of the sick parents. Well, the earth is wounded really badly. And with it, the human race is being wounded very badly. And it's because of what some humans are doing and won't stop. When the Exxon leadership back in the mid-1970s discovered the truth that their business plan was going to destroy the planet, you'd think they would have said, oh, wow, okay, let's figure out a new business plan, and we can even do it, 5 years by 5 years by 5 years, and will get out of this destroying the planet piece by piece and make it okay. You would think that that's not what they did. What they did was keep the truth a secret and lie their heads off to everybody else. They got a few scientists to lie. They got a lot of members of Congress to lie. And a lot of bankers. So they built a bulwark against the truth and made it much harder for us to solve the problem by pushing it till so late that we weren't in an easy position to solve it. So what I and the Shalom Center are now interested in is looking at each of the festivals. Hanukkah, it's got several levels of it. One of them is, indeed, conserving energy. 1 day's worth of olive oil meets 8 days' needs. That's energy conservation. Should Hanukkah be a day when synagogues take the first steps in creating at least solar co-ops of their members, not just get a solar collector on the roof of the synagogue, but their members, hundreds of them. Should they support retrofitting and private and government aid in retrofitting housing that of people too poor to be able to invest in making their houses conserve energy and use solar instead of coal energy. So that's a good reason for Hanukkah. And we could look at all the festivals and do that. So we've now begun. So I've described what we have in mind for Passover, now just a few weeks away. And we're going to continue to do that. We're going to need support to do it. We're going to need money. We hired for 6 months a national organizer who's been working on the Passover effort. But if we need to go on, we were able to raise money to do that for just 6 months. But if we're going to be able to go on for it, we're going to need to raise more. So I think nobody else in the Jewish community has said, oh, the festival cycle is exactly what should motivate us. And the faith communities, the religious communities, are desperately needed to heal this wound. Every major change in American society has had vigorous energy from the religious communities. And I wouldn't say they've been asleep, but they've been pretty sleepy about this one, even though it's the most important question the human race has ever faced. Are we going as a species to wreck the planet that we're part of and ourselves with it, or are we going to heal it? So that's, in a nutshell, that's a good biological metaphor, right? In a nutshell, that's in a nutshell what we are imagining, the way in which we see the world. People talk about a strategy of change or a theory of change. Well, ours is the faith communities, the festivals, because they are the most intense time in the faith communities. Passover especially because it's got all the elements, plagues, powers that don't care whether the planet burns up. In fact, if that's the business, that's fine. So that's what we're doing, is trying to make that work. So I've done the nutshell. I'd like you all to tell me what you think, and not only what you think, but what you would be willing to do about it. Or if I'm wrong, tell me that.
Reb Arthur, I don't think you're wrong on any of those counts. I personally can't see myself standing in front of the Chase Bank at this point. I've done that in the past, in my past life, but clearly trying to make whatever impact I can on any corporate or other kind of organizational entity that is participating in making things worse for the planet. I have to say, Seasons of Our Joy was given to me and Bob by somebody in our congregation, Steve Greenfield. I know at least Barbie would know, and said, "You got to read this." And it just turned everything around for us. And I've used, among other things, your diagram of the interrelationships between the lunar and the solar calendars numerous times, explaining how that works, and sort of why Ramadan keeps coming up in all kinds of other places. So I wonder what you can say about Islam in this, and you know, you put Ramadan and you were working towards all of this, talking about Earth Day.
Right.
So can you add those elements?
Yes. Well, we have been. About a fifth of the Quran is about the Exodus. It's there's no festival focusing on it, but it's a very important aspect of what Muslims understand as revelation. There's one really interesting difference between the Quran's version of the whole story and the Bible's version, which is that the Quran has an understanding that at the very last minute, in the Sea of Reeds, the Pharaoh does tshuva, the Pharaoh repents. Now, interestingly, there's a disagreement among Muslim scholars whether tshuva that late for such a great criminal really counts. But what intrigues me is if you see the Passover story as trying to point toward a more free, more grown up, more loving human society, then the notion that even the greatest criminal might actually repent, could be an ultimate vision. I think the Bible itself has one, at least, ultimate vision, which I think is the Song of Songs. I think the Song of Songs is the Garden of Eden for grown-ups, for a grown-up human race. And in fact, it turns out I wasn't the first Jew ever to think that. It was one of the early rabbis said, "Who is the couple in the Song of Songs?" Well, it's Adam and Eve. They got it right for a change. That is, they didn't try to gobble up every last tree. My theory is the Garden of Eden, the big mistake wasn't sex, which this guy, Augustine of Hippo, who the Catholic Church views as a saint, I don't. He was obsessed with sex. He wrote his memoirs, and he said he was. And he decided that sex was the original sin, just sex, and therefore you needed to avoid it to the extent possible. He admitted that you couldn't have the human race survive if you didn't have sex. So, okay, limited sex, limited people, but every other kind of sex, not married, masturbation, gay and lesbian, with birth control, because the only legitimate reason for it was to keep the human race going. So birth control wasn't legitimate. And he convinced a whole bunch of Christians, and it's still the official theology of especially the Catholic Church. And it's at the root of the opposition to abortion and to birth control and to gay marriage and to whatever you want to name. So why did I get onto that? Because I
What
was
the original sin
Eden.
was, actually.
So it comes out of I think, incredibly mistaken misinterpretation of the Eden story. Where does all that come from? Well, it looks like in the Eden story that the female human being begins the creation of trouble. And then the results of the mistake, if it's a mistake, I think it is, but I think it's a different mistake in Eden. Well, let me say what I think it is. I think the mistake is the voice speaking for reality says, hey, there is enormous abundance here. It's amazing. Eat of it, enjoy it, love it. Just a little self-restraint. One tree, let it alone, just to prove that you can restrain yourself. Don't gobble it all up. So the woman starts and the man follows. I think that is a whole reason for that, which I'll tell you in a minute. All depends on a midrash word. One of the things I love about the word in Torah. And there are two results. I think that the human race is growing up. It starts with being born from the earth, like a human birth or a mammalian birth from the earth, doesn't have its own independent breath when it's born. Before it's born, it's part of the mother's breath, the earth's breath, Adamah. The breath is there. Afterwards, in Hebrew, it becomes Adam. The breath ain't there. And the Torah says, in order to breathe, Yud He Vav He, which I think is the breath of life, breathe the breath into it. Just like when we have a baby, we tap it on the rear end to make sure it knows how to start breathing. So then it's a child, it's, quote, naked and not ashamed. And then I think what happens is they become adolescents. The human race as a whole becomes adolescent. And adolescents, we know, in order to grow up, have to differ from their parents. Sometimes the difference is wise and good and fine. Sometimes it's a big mistake, but it's always out of trying to grow up. So I think they made a mistake. And there are two consequences to the big mistake. One is the abundance is gone, right? The earth will give forth thorns and thistles, and you'll have to work every day of your life. Notice nobody knows about Shabbat yet. Every day of your life, you'll have to work with the sweat pouring down your face in order to make enough to eat. The other result is that women are subordinated to men. Now, the first one, nobody thinks is a command. Nobody thinks you are not allowed to invent a rake or a hoe or a plow because it might make your work easier. People go ahead and invent work that makes agriculture and every other kind of job easier. But they think there are major communities, including for a long time, the Jewish community, that thinks the second thing is a command, not just a consequence. The first one's a consequence. You know, you're going to gobble up the abundance, well, it's going to disappear. 10 years ago in the Gulf of Mexico, BP showed no self-restraint and pierced 2 miles deep and killed 11 of its own workers, and not all, thank God, but a hunk of the life of the Gulf of Mexico. That was the story of the Garden of Eden right there. But the first consequence we think is a consequence, and you got to learn to get past it. You got to learn not to gobble up the earth, and you got to learn to make tools that will make it not so terrible to eat and to find. And the second one, some men for a couple thousand years at least say, oh no, that one's a rule. Women have to be subordinate. That's not just a consequence of a mistake. So that you should grow up and learn to live beyond the mistake. That one's a rule. Well, that's crazy. The first one's not a rule. The second one's not a rule. And I think the Bible has its own wistful description of a world where it's not a rule. And that wistful description is the Song of Songs, in which men and women are equal. They're not afraid of sex, but they are able to live with it without being crazed or ashamed. They're not at war with the earth. They love it, and the earth loves them. If you just read the descriptions, it's wonderful about the growth of the earth, how it feeds them. It doesn't give just thorns and thistles. It's giving love in the form of food.
And of course, that's the text that's read at Pesach.
Yes, that's right.
Shir HaShirim.
And
Yeah.
nobody is exactly sure why, but I think
Oh
it makes
no, that's
total
obvious.
sense.
Yeah,
It makes total sense. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the spring and liberation come back again.
Mhm.
Both of them together. Thank you. So once I gave a speech at Chautauqua, which is a place that for the summer becomes a huge spiritual education center. Thousands of people come and take courses and music and art, all sorts of things. It's in upper New York State, near Lake Erie. I was asked to give a speech there on the question, what is radicalism? So the first thing I did was to dress with a red shirt and white pants. And when I got up there, I explained to them I was wearing red and white in honor of a radish. Because a radish is from, the word radish is from the same root as the word radical. And the word means root. the word radix in Latin, which gives root to, which is the root of both radical and radish, means it's the root. So I said, I'm here to talk about my root, and my root is Torah. And I talk this way about Torah. When I finished, one of the people in the audience, thinking he had caught out the rabbi, said, well, Rabbi, if your root is the Torah, what do you do with be fruitful, multiply, fill up the earth, and subdue it? Because I clearly not talking about subduing the earth. Be fruitful, multiply, fill up the earth. There are now about 8 billion of us. There were about 20 million when the Torah was written. 20 million human beings, would you believe, scattered on the entire planet. So I said, done. Now what? We have multiplied. We have filled up the earth. It's already straining at the edges, more than the edges. And we have subdued it. If you can destroy it with atom bombs, nuclear hydrogen bombs, which you can, and with CO2, which you can, and we've subdued it. You don't need to prove it by doing it. Everybody cheered when I said, done. Now what? What's next? What's the Torah of the future? I think the Song of Songs is a piece of the Torah of the future.
I think that has to be the next text we spend some time studying.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
I've always thought that one of the aspects, one of the sins, or to me, the sin in the Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, was Adam's and Eve and Chava's failure to answer God's question properly.
Where are you?
Where are you? Or where are you? And he should say, Hinani. He doesn't say Hinani. He says, oh, I had to, we were ashamed, we were naked, we had to cover up, you know. he
Very
and
nice.
that he doesn't say Hinani. And later on in
Very.
Torah, of course, we see Hinani, but you know, that's to me is one of the major aspects of the sin.
Very nice. Very
Not taking your place and taking responsibility for what you do,
right.
which goes along with the other aspect.
I have a midrashic tale about what happened in that crucial moment when she wasn't even named yet. Chava, or the woman, ate from the tree and convinced her husband to. It says there are two lines right next to each other. The first one says, the two of them were naked and not ashamed. And the word for naked is arum.
Mm.
They were arum and they were not ashamed. The very next line in the text says, the snake was the most arum of all the animals of the field. And every translation translates the second arum totally different. Shrewd, or some equivalent of the word shrewd. The snake was the most shrewd, or the most clever of all the animals. Well, I'm a writer. And I said, I love words. And I looked at that and I said, come on. If I had written those two sentences with arum right next to each other, And then it goes on with the story of the snake and the woman. That's important. And if I had written with two rooms right next to each other, that I would have been putting up a flag saying, pay attention. Notice this, we're in a room. So I said, so what if I tried thinking, like the translators got it wrong? What if I tried thinking, the second room also means naked, like the snake was the most room, the most naked of all the animals. And I said to myself, well, what sense would that make? And what came to me was the snake sheds its skin. You can't get any nakeder than shedding your skin. So, okay, the snake sheds its skin. Then I imagined a whole little tale, which is not in the Torah, but neither is Midrash. That's what Midrash is. It's reading the blank fire, the white fire between the letters, reading them to make a story. So my story is the snake goes to the woman and says, well, I'm really naked because I shed my skin. You're really naked and you're not ashamed. Your nakedness is about to shed your skin. You're going to grow up another stage and you're going to shed part of your skin. It's going to look like a mess. It's going to be bloody. It's going to be scary if you don't know what's happening. And you're going to think that you're going to die unless you explain, like I'm about to do to you, that is just part of your growing up. So shedding your skin might look like you're going to die, but it doesn't. For me, it doesn't. And for you, it won't. The voice that says if you eat from the tree, you're going to die, it's wrong. You can transform yourself. You can grow up just like I grow up when I shed my skin. And you won't die. So why don't you take a chance and eat from the tree? And she does. So that's why I think it's the snake that goes to the woman, not to the man. She goes to the man. But it starts with the snake going to the woman, because shedding your skin is the crucial thing that makes the difference. So I think growing up, it can be a big mistake, because growing up is what the Torah, I think, is all about. That the Torah is yearning for the human race to grow up already, to grow up and love the earth and open to the earth to love back,
So
to love each other. So that's, but I love your hineni.
what occurs to me is, as you say this also, that the Pesach and the emergence of the Israelites from their slavery through the narrow place into the wide, vast Bamidbar is also the shedding of the skin of slavery, of one type of connection,
Right.
to a new opportunity for a new skin.
Right. It's also, by the way, there are two moments that seem to me to be a birth in the Exodus story. One is the voice says, smear blood on your doorposts and don't come out till morning. And that's when all the firstborns of Egypt die. But the firstborns of the people who smear blood on their doorposts don't die. Well, what's going on? What is a house where blood is the way out? And what is the house? You know, if you think about it, what is the house that every human being lives in and comes out of with a circle of blood around the coming out?
The womb.
What?
Yeah.
The womb.
The womb. The womb. I think this is the moment the people are born. They have to walk out the next morning and be born. And if they're born, then there's no space for the angel of death to come in to their house. If they're in the middle of being born, that takes up all the space there is. And the second time is at the sea. We talk about the breaking of the waters in birth. And I think the decision as to what to do, here you are. You're stuck at the edge of this sea. You don't know it's going to split. It's the sea. It's roiling and tumbling and frightening and crashing with waves. And behind you are the hoofbeats of Pharaoh's chariot army. And some of you are probably saying, because we know the story says that they kept saying it even in the wilderness, saying, well, slavery's bad, but come on, there's onions and there's garlic and there's meat. And who knows what we're going to eat up there in the wilderness? Come on. And who knows? There's no way across this ocean. So we better let the army take us back. It's a big decision. I mean, I think the whole human race is at that decision point right now. The seventh night of Pesach is when traditionally that happened. I think we're all living. The people who say, all I want is normal life, and vote with anger at anybody who wants to cross into the unknown. It's unknown. It's true. It's unknown. And it is shedding your skin. You're right. So all the people who are scared to go into the unknown are, happy about it, but what the hell? We lived in, slavery. And after all, it did have pickles and all that delicious stuff, meat. One guy takes a chance. Who knows? It's the unknown. I mean, no. The answer is who knows. The answer is nobody knows. So he walks in, and it doesn't budge until he's up to his nose, according to the Midrash. And not till then does the ocean split. Even then, they go into the wilderness and they don't really have a clue about how they're going to live through the process. And that's where we are. We don't know. I don't know. I mean, I have glimmers of what it could be like. I wrote a whole book about dancing in God's earthquake, which is an attempt to say, look, there are pieces of Torah, not only the Song of Songs, but other pieces too, that we could draw on for a new pattern of life. We could. There is life on the other side of the Red Sea. and only a terrible life with Pharaoh's army running it. But who knows? I mean, my book is certainly not stormed the whatever you storm. So we're all living in that space of uncertainty. So that's the second moment, the waters break. It's the second moment which takes being born twice in the Torah story. Not even in the right order.
Interesting. Wow. My brain is awash with imagery on this.
Got to do a paper cut.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
I'm
I
sorry,
don't know
what?
about that. I don't know about that.
Oh yeah.
I couldn't hear.
Oh, Mishka's a paper cut artist, so I was thinking I put the images into something.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I'll work on that.
Is an idea.
Send
When
me
you get
the
a
pictures
chance.
when you do. Really?
Huh? I'm sorry. I didn't hear that.
I said, send me the pictures when you do.
I will. Well, you got the pictures I did send, I'm happy to say.
Yeah.
Totally different. Wow. So Pesach and ends on Earth Day. But the last day of Pesach is Earth Day. Yes?
Uh-huh. We know. Well,
I mean,
we're suggesting actually using a piece. Let me go back a step. We have written at the Shalom Center, we've written a Haggadah. We're calling it the Earth and Justice Freedom Seder. It's a new Freedom Seder, with even a bigger difference from the older ones than the original was, because it is about the earth, and about justice, but the earth is a big part of it. It could be used at a family seder, like on the first night or the second night or the third night. There's a whole tradition about a third seder. It could be used at a congregational seder or a communal seder or an interfaith seder. And not the whole thing, but a slice of it could be used to be chanted in front of a bank. You could take, and the heart of it, I think the heart of it for use at a bank, it would probably be the matzah. What does the Torah say about the matzah? It says the people were told, you can't dawdle, you can't tarry, bake this stuff and get out of town. Martin Luther King, in that great speech a year before he was killed, talked about the fierce urgency of now. Well, that's what the matzah is. It's an edible, fierce urgency of now. And we think probably the matzah would be the one crucial meal, food from the Seder at the Chase Bank. And we're even working to write a letter, a one-page letter that people could take into the bank, not violating the law, with a sheet of matzah, go up to the teller and say, I have a letter to the head of your bank, and I've got a sheet of matzah to explain why. And just hand them the sheet of matzah and the letter. So that would make, I don't know if you would feel like you could do that. Maybe you could. But that's one thing. And there are many other things. People could look at their credit cards, turn them over, and
That's,
see what bank has issued the credit card. If it's Chase Bank, maybe you want to figure out the time. Maybe there's time before Pesach, or maybe there isn't. But figure out what it would mean to replace your Chase credit card with a different one. Maybe a local credit union, maybe a small bank that isn't investing in burning the world. And make a point of sending it back to Chase with a note saying, maybe cut up and with a note saying, I'm not interested in having my money go to burn up the world. Stop.
yeah,
And put your money instead into a whole series of earthy, pro-life things. I should mention there's a website called Exodus Alliance, just those two .org. Exodus Alliance, just those two words, .org. And on it is the Seder, the Haggadah that we've written, material about the investment policy of Chase and other big investors in burning up the planet. Other inspirational items, advice about action, who to consult about a permit if you need one, and so on, all that kind of stuff. So it's Exodus Alliance.org.
got that down. Very cool. So this is something that's been an interfaith,
Yes.
I don't know what the right word is.
Yeah.
Product or.
Yeah. One of the things we do is we have that piece I mentioned from the Quran about Pharaoh doing tshuva, repenting,
Yes.
at the end of the Haggadah as part of, along with the Song of Songs, part of a vision of what the world could be. And we have a little piece of the story of the first Palm Sunday at the beginning of it. Palms are symbols of green, renewing life in the spring. So what's the story of Palm Sunday? Why do Christians wave the palm thing, and why do they see Palm Sunday as the first day of Holy Week? Well, there was a demonstration, a Jewish demonstration, because it was a Jewish society led by a Jewish rabbi named, whatever he was named, but Jesus in Greek. It started at the Mount of Olives on the edge of Jerusalem, and it went into the city, and the people were chanting. What were they chanting? They were chanting psalms, especially one where the refrain is, Ki li'olam chasdo, for your loving kindness is forever. And they're chanting along the way, and some officials of the Roman Empire and maybe the local puppet government, because the whole region was governed by Rome through local folks they hired to do it. The local officials shout at Jesus, tell your people to shut up and stop chanting. And he says, if they would be quiet, the very stones would speak. So about 6 or 7 years ago, I was invited to give a sermon on Palm Sunday in a church in New York City. So giving a sermon, I mean, I know what that means. That means taking a text and giving a midrash. That's what a sermon is, a midrash on a text. So I took that text. If they would be silent, the very stones would speak. And I said, in our generation, the very stones are speaking. The glaciers are weeping as they melt. The coral reefs are wailing as they die. The mountaintops of West Virginia are screaming as they're torn to pieces to get cheap coal. The very stones are speaking. We better speak. So we're including that in the Haggadah. It's a Christian take on the week. The week began Holy Week began a few days before Passover. Christian tradition is that the Last Supper was a Passover Seder. It makes sense to me. If you're going to challenge an empire, then Passover is the right time to do it. If you're a Jewish community that wants to challenge an empire, obviously Passover is the right time. So it all makes sense to me. And it makes sense to some Christians too.
Wow. How was that received?
They like it. They dig it. Look, I mean, so far as I'm concerned, Holy Week until Friday, until the Roman Empire executes, tortures, and executes this troublemaker, that whole thing is a Jewish story. Sunday is when maybe it stops being a Jewish story, the resurrection. Though there are some stories of resurrection what's his name?
Elisha.
Elisha, right.
And
Thank you.
Elijah. Eliyahu
Elisha and Elijah, they do, not often, but they do resurrections occasionally. But leave that aside even. The rest of the story of that week is a story of a Jewish nonviolent movement against the empire.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what time it is.
It's time, I'm sorry to say, it's officially 8:54 according
Okay,
to my
right.
my thing. So it's time, even though I don't want it to be time. My cat is hurting me there.